Broken vows. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though silence itself had learned to listen. Clara Whitmore sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. The room carried the faint scent of oil and dust, familiar yet suffocating. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She had once believed that marriage would soften the world. That love, once secured, would remain steady, like the walls of this house, unmoving and dependable. But now, even the walls seemed to hold secrets. Clara's gaze drifted to the window, with a last light of evening stretched thin across the horizon. Thomas would not be home yet. He had not been home early in weeks. At first, she had told herself it was work, long hours, growing responsibilities. That was what a good wife believed, what she had been taught to believe. But belief, she had learned, could be a fragile thing. She stood slowly, her body heavy with a weariness that sleep could not cure. Her reflection in the small mirror startled her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too familiar. The same pale face, the same careful posture, the same woman who had spent months pretending not to notice the growing distance between herself and her husband. Clara reached up, adjusting the neckline of her dress, as though modesty could shield her from something deeper than exposure. Her fingers lingered there, pressing the fabric close, grounding herself in its texture. It had started with small things, a pause in conversation, a glance that lingered too long elsewhere. The way Thomas no longer looked at her, as though she were something worth seeing. Then came the nights he did not return at all. She had asked once, quietly, carefully, as though the question itself might break if spoken too loudly. He had smiled then, a practiced, effortless smile, and told her she worried too much, that she imagined things. Clara had nodded. Of course she had, because it was easier to doubt herself than to face what might be true. But truth had a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully it was avoided. The letter had not been meant for her. She found it by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. It had been tucked inside Thomas's coat, the edge of it visible just enough to draw her attention. Clara had hesitated before touching it, her hand hovering in the air as though some part of her already knew what it contained. She told herself she was wrong, that she would prove herself wrong. But the moment she unfolded the paper, something inside her shifted, quietly, irrevocably. The handwriting was not his. Soft, deliberate strokes formed words that were not meant for a wife to read. Words filled with familiarity, with intimacy, with a warmth Clara had not felt in months. Evelyn. The name alone had been enough to still her breath. Evelyn Hart, her friend, or what she had once believed to be a friend. A woman who had sat across from her at this very table, sharing tea and laughter, speaking in gentle tones that now felt like echoes of a lie. Clara had read the letter only once. That had been enough. She had folded it carefully, placing it back exactly where she had found it. Her movements had been precise, controlled. No trembling, no tears. Not then. The breaking came later. Now, standing alone in the dim light, Clara pressed her hand against her chest, as though she could quiet the ache there by force. It was not the betrayal alone that wounded her. It was the realization of how long it had been happening, how deeply she had ignored the signs, how easily she had been replaced. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Thomas stepped inside, brushing dust from his coat as though nothing in the world required urgency. He glanced at her briefly, his expression neutral, unreadable. "You're still awake," he said, his tone carrying a faint note of surprise. Clara studied him in silence. The man before her was the same one she had married. Same voice, same face, but something essential had been stripped away. Or perhaps it had never been there to begin with. "I found your letter," she said. The words settled between them, heavy and immovable. Thomas paused, just for a moment. Then he exhaled, a quiet, almost weary sound, as though the burden of truth inconvenienced him. "You shouldn't have gone through my things." There was no denial, no urgency, no attempt to repair what had been broken. Clara felt something inside her steady at that. "I didn't have to look far," she replied, her voice calm in a way that surprised even her. He removed his coat, setting it aside with deliberate care. It doesn't change anything. But it did. Clara could feel it now. The shift, the quiet unraveling of everything she had once held on to. The fear that had kept her silent began to loosen its grip, replaced by something colder, clearer. It changes everything, she said. Thomas met her gaze then, truly looking at her for the first time in what felt like an eternity. But there was no remorse in his eyes, only a distant calculation. You're overreacting. Clara almost laughed, not because it was amusing, but because it was expected. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, no longer unnatural, but revealing. At last, Clara turned away. She did not argue. She did not plead. Instead, she reached for the small bag she had packed earlier that evening, before he had arrived, before this conversation had begun. Perhaps some part of her had already known how it would end. "Where are you going?" Thomas asked, his voice sharper now. Clara paused at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame. "I don't know," she said honestly. And for the first time in months, the uncertainty did not terrify her. It freed her. Without another word, she stepped into the fading light, leaving behind the house, the silence, and the man who had mistaken her endurance for weakness. The night air was cool against her skin, sharp and unfamiliar. Clara pulled her dress closer around her, not out of fear, but out of instinct, a small act of control in a world that had taken so much from her. Behind her, the door remained open, but she did not look back. A stranger's silence. The night stretched endlessly before Clara, vast and indifferent, swallowing the fragile certainty she had carried out of her home. Each step she took felt both deliberate and uncertain, as though she were walking away from one life without yet arriving at another. The road had long since disappeared behind her. Now there was only open land, dry earth, scattered brush, and the quiet hum of wind moving through emptiness. Clara tightened her grip on the small bag in her hand, her other arm wrapped instinctively around herself. The thin fabric of her dress offered little protection against the cooling air, but she clung to it as though it were the last piece of herself she still recognized. She did not know how far she had walked. Time had lost its shape somewhere between the moment she closed the door and the moment the sky deepened into darkness. What she did know was that she could not go back. The thought did not arrive with fear this time, but with a quiet certainty that settled deep within her chest. Her steps slowed as she spotted a faint structure ahead, a cabin, worn and solitary, its outline barely visible against the night. It stood apart from everything, as though it too had chosen isolation over belonging. Clara hesitated. It could mean shelter. It could mean danger. But exhaustion had a way of silencing hesitation. She approached carefully, each movement measured, her breath shallow. The door stood slightly ajar, swaying faintly with the wind. No light flickered from within. No sound suggested life or presence. Still, something about the place felt watched. Clara pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of wood and dust. A single bed rested against the wall, rough but intact. A table stood nearby, bare except for a small clay jug. She lingered near the doorway for a moment, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No voice. Only silence. Clara moved toward the bed slowly, her body trembling now, not from fear alone, but from the strain of everything she had endured. She set her bag aside and lowered herself onto the edge of the mattress, her fingers instinctively clutching the fabric of her dress once more. The quiet pressed in around her, and for the first time since leaving, the weight of everything she had held back began to surface. Her breath faltered, her chest tightened, but no tears came. She had already spent them somewhere along the road, leaving behind only a hollow ache that refused to soften. A faint sound broke the stillness. Clara stiffened. It was subtle, a shift, a presence, something that did not belong to the silence of an empty cabin. She turned slowly. He stood near the far wall, partially shadowed, as though he had always been there, and she had simply failed to see him. Clara's breath caught. The man was tall, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. His long dark hair was braided neatly, resting over one shoulder. His clothing was simple, worn but practical, blending into the muted tones of the room. He did not move toward her. He did not speak. He simply watched. Fear surged through Clara, sharp and immediate, cutting through her exhaustion. Her hands tightened around her dress, pulling the fabric closer, as though it could shield her from what she did not understand. "I didn't know anyone was here," she said, her voice unsteady but audible. The man remained silent. His gaze did not wander, did not assess her in the way she had come to expect from men. There was no hunger in it, no calculation, only a quiet awareness that unsettled her more than anything else. Clara rose to her feet, though her legs threatened to fail her. "I'll leave," she added quickly. Still, he did not move to stop her, but he did not step aside either. The space between them held something unspoken, something Clara could not yet name. Her breath came faster now, panic creeping in at the edges. "I won't take anything," she continued, her words tumbling over themselves. "I just needed—" Her voice broke. The man took a single step forward. Clara flinched. "Don't," she said sharply, retreating until the back of her legs met the bed. Her hands clutched her dress tighter, anchoring it firmly against her skin. "Don't untie my dress," she pleaded, the words escaping before she could stop them. Silence followed, but it was no longer empty. The man stilled. Something shifted in his expression, not softness, not pity, but recognition, as though he understood more than she had said. And then, without a word, he stepped back. The distance between them widened. Clara blinked, her breath uneven, her heart still racing. He turned slightly, reaching for the clay jug on the table. His movements were slow, deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He poured water into a small cup and placed it carefully on the edge of the table closest to her. Then he stepped away again, farther this time. The gesture was simple, almost insignificant, and yet it struck Clara with unexpected force. He had not touched her. He had not questioned her. He had not even spoken. Instead, he had listened to words she had not meant to say aloud, to fear she had not meant to reveal. Clara's grip on her dress loosened slightly. Her gaze flickered between the cup of water and the man who now stood near the doorway, his presence no longer threatening, but distant, controlled, respectful. It was unfamiliar, and because it was unfamiliar, it unsettled her more deeply than anything else. She took a cautious step forward, then another, until she reached the table. Her hand trembled as she picked up the cup, the cool surface grounding her in the present. She drank slowly, aware of his gaze, but no longer paralyzed by it. When she lowered the cup, the silence between them felt different. Not empty, not oppressive, but patient. Clara looked at him again, really looked this time. "You're not going to hurt me," she said quietly, as though testing the truth of it. He did not answer, but he did not need to. The absence of action spoke louder than any reassurance. Clara exhaled, a slow, unsteady breath that carried with it the first trace of something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety, not yet, but the possibility of it. She turned back toward the bed, her movements less rigid now, though still cautious. Sitting down, she adjusted her dress once more, this time not out of fear, but out of habit, of control she was not ready to release. The man remained where he was, near the doorway, as though guarding both the entrance and the space between them. Clara lay back slowly, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Her eyes remained open for a moment longer, watching him. "You can stay," she said softly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. It was not trust, but it was no longer fear. And as sleep began to pull her under, Clara realized that for the first time since everything had fallen apart, she was not alone in a way that felt dangerous. The uncertainty remained, the shape of quiet healing. Morning arrived without ceremony, slipping gently through the cracks in the cabin walls. Clara woke slowly, her senses returning in fragments. The firmness of the bed beneath her, the faint warmth of sunlight brushing her face, and the unfamiliar stillness that no longer felt threatening. For a moment, she did not move. Then memory returned. The road, the house, the letter, and him. Clara's eyes opened fully. Her gaze shifted across the room, searching instinctively. The man was no longer standing by the doorway, but his presence lingered in the careful order of the space. The cup she had used the night before had been cleaned and set aside. The door was closed now, though she could not remember hearing it. He was still here, but he had moved without disturbing her. That realization settled into her thoughts with quiet weight. Clara sat up slowly, her body stiff but no longer trembling. Her hand rose to her shoulder, tracing the faint soreness that remained, not from any single injury, but from days of strain she had ignored. She adjusted her dress, pulling it securely into place, though her grip was less desperate now. A soft sound came from outside. Clara turned her head, listening. It was not the sound of intrusion, but of movement, measured, purposeful. She hesitated, then stood, her steps cautious as she moved toward the door. Each movement felt like a choice rather than a reaction, and that alone marked a change. When she stepped outside, the morning air greeted her with a cool clarity. The land stretched wide and open, untouched by the noise of towns or the weight of expectation. For the first time, she noticed its stillness not as emptiness, but as space. He stood a short distance away. Tala. The name had not been spoken yet, but it would come later. For now, he was simply the man who had not crossed a line she had feared would be broken. He was working with quiet focus, repairing a section of the cabin's outer wall. His movements were precise, efficient, as though each action carried purpose beyond the immediate task. He did not look at her right away, but Clara sensed that he knew she was there. She lingered near the doorway, uncertain. "I didn't leave," she said finally, her voice steady but soft. He paused, then turned his head slightly, not fully facing her, but enough to acknowledge her presence. It was not surprise she saw in his expression. It was acceptance. Clara stepped forward, closing a small part of the distance between them. The ground beneath her feet felt unfamiliar, yet stable, as though it asked nothing of her except that she stand. "You could have," she added, though she was not sure why the words mattered. He straightened slowly, setting aside the piece of wood in his hand. For a moment, he studied her, not with intensity, but with a quiet attention that neither pressed nor retreated. Then, after a pause, he spoke. "Tala." The single word settled between them. Clara blinked, caught off guard by the sound of his voice. It was calm, low, carrying no urgency. "Clara," she replied, the introduction feeling strangely significant. A silence followed, but it was no longer uncertain. It held shape now, defined by the exchange rather than the absence of it. Tala gestured briefly toward the cabin, then toward the land beyond, as though offering something without needing to name it. Clara understood more than she expected. "You live here," she said. He gave a small nod. The simplicity of it grounded her. There were no explanations, no justifications, only what was. Clara's gaze drifted across the open space, then back to the cabin. "You let me stay." Another nod. Not permission, not obligation, just a quiet acknowledgement of choice. Clara exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing in a way she had not noticed until now. "You didn't ask anything in return." Tala's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle indication that the idea itself was unnecessary. Clara looked down at her hands, noticing how they no longer clutched her dress with the same urgency. The fabric still rested beneath her fingers, but her grip had loosened, her touch less defensive. "You're different," she said, the words leaving her before she could measure them. Tala did not respond, but he did not need to. Clara stepped closer, drawn not by certainty, but by the absence of fear. The distance between them remained respectful, unbroken, yet it no longer felt like a barrier. "I thought," she began, then stopped. The words were difficult to shape, not because they were unclear, but because they required her to face something she had long avoided. "I thought all men," she hesitated, her voice tightening slightly, "took what they wanted." The admission lingered in the air, fragile but honest. Tala's gaze held hers for a moment, steady and unreadable. Then he turned slightly, picking up the tools he had set aside. His actions did not dismiss her words, but neither did they dwell on them. Instead, he continued working. Clara watched him, something shifting within her understanding. He did not correct her. He did not defend himself. He simply existed in contradiction to what she had believed. And that was enough. The realization did not come as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unraveling of something tightly wound. She had been taught to endure, to remain, to accept. But standing here, in the quiet presence of someone who demanded nothing, she began to see another possibility. One where she chose. Clara turned slightly, her gaze falling on the horizon. The world stretched outward, unclaimed, unpromised. For the first time, she did not feel lost within it. Behind her, Tala continued his work, the steady rhythm of his movements grounding the space around them. He did not ask her to stay. He did not ask her to leave. And in that absence of expectation, Clara felt something begin to take shape within her, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of control. She reached for the edge of her dress, adjusting it once more. But this time, the gesture carried no fear, only intention. When she looked back at Tala, her expression had changed, subtly, but undeniably. "I can help," she said. The offer was simple, but it was the first thing she had chosen for herself in a very long time. Tala paused, considering her for a moment. Then, quietly, he handed her a piece of wood. No words, no hesitation, just acceptance. Clara took it, her fingers steady, and as she stood beside him, the silence between them no longer felt like something to endure. It felt like something they were building carefully, deliberately, one moment at a time. The past had not disappeared, but for the first time, it no longer defined the space she stood in. And somewhere beyond that realization, a question began to form, not of what had been done to her, but of what she would choose next, what she chose to keep. The silence after Thomas's departure did not feel empty. It felt earned. Clara remained where she stood, her gaze fixed on the horizon long after the sound of hoofbeats had disappeared. The air carried a faint trace of dust, a lingering reminder that the past had come close enough to touch her, and had failed to take hold. Her hands were steady. That was the first thing she noticed. Not the absence of fear, not the quiet around her, but the simple fact that her body no longer betrayed her with trembling. The instinct to shrink, to retreat, to make herself smaller in the presence of conflict. Those impulses had faded, leaving behind something firmer, something chosen. Behind her, Tala had not moved. He had not stepped forward during the confrontation. He had not spoken on her behalf. He had not turned the moment into something it was not. And yet, his presence had never wavered. Clara turned slowly, her eyes finding him where he stood. There was no question in his expression, no expectation waiting to be fulfilled. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not offer comfort she had not requested. He simply remained. It was a kind of respect she was still learning to understand. "He won't come back," she said, her voice calm, as though the certainty had already settled within her. Tala studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Clara exhaled softly, letting the weight of the moment shift into something she could carry. For so long, her life had been shaped by what others demanded of her, by expectations she had never chosen, by silence she had been taught to maintain. Now, standing in the open space beyond all of that, she felt the unfamiliar pull of possibility. It did not rush her. It did not overwhelm her. It simply waited. Clara glanced toward the cabin, her gaze tracing the lines of its worn structure. The repaired wall, the door that no longer hung loosely from its hinges, the small details that marked effort and care. This place had not been given to her. She had stepped into it, and in quiet ways, she had begun to shape it. "I should go," she said after a moment. The words did not come from fear. They came from something deeper, an understanding that staying, leaving, or choosing anything at all now belonged to her alone. Tala's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, as though he were listening not just to her words, but to the meaning behind them. Clara took a step forward, then stopped. For a brief moment, Uncertainty flickered, not the kind that weakened her, but the kind that asked her to consider what she truly wanted. She looked at him again. "You didn't ask me to stay," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a realization. Tala met her gaze, his silence steady, unbroken. Clara nodded slowly, understanding settling into place. You didn't need to. The truth of it felt simple. He had never tried to keep her, and because of that, she had never felt the need to leave. Clara's fingers brushed lightly against the fabric of her dress, adjusting it without thought. The gesture had once been driven by fear, by the need to protect herself from being seen, from being taken, from being diminished. Now it felt different. Not a shield, a choice. She let her hand fall to her side. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted. For the first time, the uncertainty did not carry dread. It carried space. Tala stepped closer then, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to acknowledge the moment as something shared. His presence remained careful, deliberate, as though every movement respected the boundary she had drawn long before he understood it. "You choose," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything she had heard in a long time. Clara felt them settle into her, not as instruction, but as permission. No one had ever said that to her before. Not her husband, not the life she had left behind. Choice had never been hers. Until now, she looked out once more at the open land, at the path Thomas had taken, now empty and distant. The past had defined her once. It had shaped her decisions, her fears, her silence. But it no longer held her. Clara turned back toward the cabin, toward the space she had helped rebuild, toward the man who had never asked for more than she was willing to give. "I'll stay," she said. The words came without hesitation, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, she was choosing where she belonged. Tala did not smile. He did not move closer, but something in his stillness shifted, as though the decision had been received exactly as it was meant to be, without expectation, without demand. Clara stepped past him, moving toward the cabin with quiet certainty. The air felt different now, lighter in a way she could not fully explain. Each step carried intention, not escape. At the doorway, she paused, not to look back at the past, but to recognize the threshold she was crossing. Then she stepped inside, and this time, she did not feel like a stranger.